The sun was just a pale promise on the horizon when Amara Clark eased open the violin case outside the grand pillars of Crescent Symphony Hall. The air held the hush of dawn, broken only by the distant hum of early commuters and the soft drip of dew from the marble steps. She had arrived hours before the orchestra's weekend matinee, drawn by the rejection letter still folded in her pocket, an anonymous note that praised her impeccable technique, but dismissed her raw emotional timbre as unsuited to their refined aesthetic. With practiced fingers, she tuned the strings to perfect A, her heart thrumming in sync with the first sweet resonance that filled the empty plaza. Her first piece was the Adagio from Barber's Violin Concerto, the slow opening notes stretching across the quiet space like a ribbon of velvet. Each phrase traced Amara's story: the fervent late-night rehearsals in her cramped apartment, the financial struggles that forced her to choose between buying rosin and eating, the countless auditions in which panels had nodded politely, only to usher the next whiter faces onto the stage. As her bow glided, the marble columns captured and echoed her lament, transforming private grief into public testimony. A lone jogger paused mid-stride, then slowed to listen. A group of office workers spilled from a nearby cafe, their chatter falling away as the violin's cry pulled them into rapt attention. By the time Amara transitioned into the buoyant swing of Gershwin's Lullaby, the plaza had become a living amphitheater. Phones emerged to record every sultry turn of her melody, and an impromptu circle formed. Students leaning on backpacks, children perched on benches, even an elderly man steadying himself with a cane as tears glistened on his cheeks. Light from a single street lamp caught her silhouette, casting long shadows that danced with the rhythm of her bow. In that moment, Amara was no longer a stranger denied entry. She was the voice of every unseen artist whose talent had been judged by color instead of caliber. And as her final note trembled into the morning air, the hush deepened, heavy with the promise that this street concert was only the first movement in a symphony of change. By mid-morning, Amara's street performance had transformed the empty plaza into an impromptu concert hall. A passerby's video clip of her soaring lullaby riff had already exploded across social media, tag number Sound of Justice. Within minutes, comments flooded in. She belongs on that stage. Symphony Hall owes her an apology. Even the local NPR affiliate messaged her for an interview. Your music is the story we need to hear, their producer wrote. Word spread faster than a crescendo. A group of music students from the nearby conservatory arrived, crowding the front row and whispering, "Your vibrato is incredible." A trio of retired symphony patrons shuffled forward, eyes bright with recognition of the melody. One held up a donated violin in solidarity. Another offered her worn season tickets, and the third pressed a check for the local music scholarship fund into Amara's hand. Meanwhile, business owners along the boulevard opened their doors. The cafe next door wheeled out a table of croissants and coffee for free. A flower shop stacked vases at the plaza's edge, each holding a single white rose for Amara. An elderly street sweeper paused in his daily route, leaning on his broom as he closed his eyes and let the barber's adagio wash over him. Under a canopy of beeping delivery trucks and squealing bike tires, the crowd swelled. A local news crew wove through the throng, microphones extended as viewers tuned in for a live shot of the defiant violinist. Amara paused between pieces to address her growing audience. She spoke of her love for the symphony's storied past and her heartbreak at its exclusionary audition policies. She called for every music lover in the city to join her in demanding open, blind audition processes that judged only the purity of sound and the depth of feeling. As the sun climbed higher, her final piece, a rousing arrangement of Piazzolla's Libertango, lifted the crowd to their feet tapping in unison. Children danced, their laughter weaving through the violin's urgent rhythms. Phones and cameras captured every flourish, broadcasting the moment to thousands more viewers who were just then logging on. By the time she packed away her violin, dozens of concertgoers had hand-printed flyers demanding her reinstatement at Crescent Hall, and a petition on the city's official website had already gathered enough signatures to require a council hearing. Amara walked away from the plaza with her violin in hand and her resolve burning brighter than ever. She had come to play a protest into existence, and by storming the city's sidewalk with her music, she had struck the first note in a movement powerful enough to rewrite the rules of every stage in town. Inside the mahogany-paneled boardroom of Crescent Symphony Hall, the executive committee gathered at a long oval table beneath a glittering chandelier, its crystals shaking with the hum of crisis. Board members shuffled folders stamped urgent, their faces drawn and guarded. On a wall-mounted screen flickered images of Amara Clark's street performance. The Marble Plaza thronged with listeners, NYC-style Sound of Justice tweets, and local news clips hailing her sonic protest. The arts director, a silver-haired gentleman in a tailored vest, cleared his throat. "We cannot ignore this groundswell," he said, voice tense. "Our ticket sales projections are tanking. People want inclusivity, not exclusion. But what precedent do we set if we reinstate every rejected artist?" A younger trustee, tapping furiously at a tablet, countered, "Our social media sentiment is 92% in her favor. Sponsors are calling for statements. If we don't act decisively, we risk alienating donors and our community." Across from her, the chief conductor, hands folded like a supplicant, restated his initial defense. "Our artistic vision must remain uncompromised. Excellence is our sole criterion." But the hall director interrupted with sobering data. Letters from the symphony's own musicians demanding blind auditions, an open letter from the mayor's office referencing the city arts ordinance, and a scheduled council hearing on cultural equity in public institutions. He laid out a stark timeline. The hearing was in 3 days. The press deadline loomed tomorrow. The committee's silence rang louder than any applause. Suddenly, the board president, whose tenure began in an era when exclusivity was unquestioned, leaned forward, eyes bright with resolve. "We offered Ms. Clark an apology behind closed doors," he acknowledged. "It's time to make it public and substantive." He tapped his gavel and directed staff to draft a resolution. Immediate reinstatement of Amara Clark as a featured soloist at the next symphony season, adoption of blind and diverse panel audition procedures, and a community outreach concert series on the plaza where she first played. Murmurs of reluctant agreement rippled around the table. A junior trustee sighed and said, "Perhaps this is the rebirth our institution needs." As hands signed off on the resolution, the data streams from social media and petitions shifted from a crisis briefing to a roadmap for transformation. Outside the boardroom door, choir music drifted down the hallway, a rehearsal of the youth ensemble that would headline the new plaza concerts. In that moment, Crescent Symphony Hall's elite circle sealed not just Amara's fate, but the destiny of every artist whose talent deserved a stage, regardless of creed or color. When the invitation arrived, an embossed card delivered by courier to her apartment door, Amara paused before opening it, her violin case resting at her side like a patient witness. Inside, the symphony's board president offered a formally worded apology, acknowledgement of the public's support, and an offer of a featured solo performance in the upcoming season opener. Yet the letter's fine print still reserved to the board the sole discretion over future programming, and made no mention of changing their outdated audition policies. That evening, Amara walked the marble lobby of Crescent Hall with the invitation in hand, her footsteps echoing along the gilded corridors. She passed the ticket booth, where ushers in crisp uniforms glanced at her card but said nothing. In the grand hall, rows of empty seats stretched toward the proscenium, their red velvet cushions awaiting audiences she would now address. Light from the ornate chandeliers shimmered on the polished wood floor, illuminating the stage where she had once dreamed of standing. She climbed the shallow steps and stood center stage, violin in hand, and let the hush of the hall settle around her. After an opening phrase that resonated like a question, she set down her bow and spoke in a clear, unwavering voice. "I appreciate your apology and this platform you now offer me. But music is more than notes. It is the soundtrack of our shared humanity. Until your audition process is blind, until your panels reflect the city's diversity, your stages will remain incomplete." Her words filled the hall like a powerful chord. Behind her, The empty seats seemed to lean in. She continued, outlining specific reforms, anonymous recordings for preliminary rounds, quotas ensuring at least 30% of finalists come from underrepresented backgrounds, and a community advisory panel to oversee equity in programming. Each demand was precise, non-negotiable, and rooted in the promise that excellence flourishes only when every gifted artist has a fair chance. Moments later, the hall manager emerged from the wings, clipboard in hand, an apology on his lips. "Miss Clark, we can discuss modifications." Amara held up her hand to stop him. "This is not a request for tweaks. It is a blueprint for justice. I will perform here only when these changes are written into policy." She picked up her violin, tuned the G string once, and played a single sustained note that vibrated through the rafters, an oral declaration that echoed beyond any spoken promise. In the days that followed, her speech went viral. Excerpts shared on classical music forums. Local radio played her resolute words alongside her street recordings, and civic groups rallied around her policy platform. Under renewed pressure, the symphony's board convened again, and this time voted unanimously to adopt her reforms. A formal ordinance was published on their website, pledging blind auditions, diverse panels, and community oversight. Finally, months later, Amara returned to that same stage, invited not as a concession but as a herald of a new era. As her bow glided through the opening strains of the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto, the audience rose in a standing ovation. In the front row sat young musicians of every background, their presence a living testament to the doors her principled stand had flung open. And as her final note rang clear, the grand hall itself seemed to sigh in relief. No longer a monument to exclusion, but a sanctuary where every voice, unbound by prejudice, could sing. The morning after the board's vote to adopt her reforms, Amara arrived at the hall before dawn, carrying a stack of unmarked audition recordings on USB drives. She unlocked the heavy doors herself, no longer an outsider denied entry, and set up folding chairs in a rehearsal room with floor-to-ceiling mirrors. By mid-morning, a diverse line of hopeful musicians had gathered. A teenage cellist from the East Side, a flutist whose ancestors had sung in gospel choirs, a veteran percussionist returning after decades in obscurity. None knew how the process would unfold, only that this was their first chance to be judged solely by their sound. Amara took the stage and welcomed them with a calm smile. She explained the new blind audition protocol. Panels seated behind a curtain, music played from behind a one-way mirror, and every candidate's name replaced by a number. The Community Advisory Board, composed of local educators, fellow musicians, and civic leaders, watched from the back row, clipboard in hand. As the first cellist cued her bow, Amara gave a subtle nod, and the panelists bent forward, ears attuned to every nuance. Throughout the day, the room pulsed with the rhythm of bowed strings, breathy winds, and plucked bass lines. Each performance was met with respectful silence, followed by measured applause once the number was revealed. In the hall's lobby, monitors displayed real-time tallies, ensuring transparency. Parents who had once worried about their children's futures now cheered every emerging talent. A sense of collective pride filled the space. The hall's walls, once guarded by exclusion, now rang with the promise of genuine merit. By evening, the auditions concluded. The panel emerged from behind the curtain, revealing faces both young and old, white and brown, students and retirees, each one committed to equity. Amara joined them to announce the shortlist. 6 new members for next season's orchestra, chosen purely for excellence. Among them was the teenage cellist, eyes bright with disbelief, the flutist whose airy tone had floated above all others, and the percussionist whose intricate rhythms had nearly brought the panel to its feet. One by one, they took the stage to accept their call letters, each name a triumph over the biases that had once silenced them. Later that week, the citywide press hailed Crescent Hall's first blind auditions as a model of cultural transformation. Editorials praised the board's courage. Social media buzzed with profiles of the newly chosen musicians, and Amara's phone buzzed with invitations to speak at other institutions eager to replicate the process. In her dressing room, she gently placed her violin on its stand and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had not only reclaimed her own place on the stage, but had carved pathways for countless others whose voices would now be heard and whose music would enrich the hall's grand traditions for years to come. Under the glow of a pastel sunrise, Amara stepped onto the riverfront plaza once more, this time not as a lone protester, but as the honored curator of the Crescent Hall Community Concert Series. A sleek stage had been erected beneath the same marble columns where she had first played, now draped in banners bearing the symphony's crest and the words, "Music for All." Technicians ran sound checks as families gathered on blankets, children chased each other between folding chairs, and local food vendors prepared espresso and pastry stands at the plaza's edge, eager to fuel the morning's celebration. Amara raised her hand for silence, then spoke into the microphone with warm authority, reminding the audience how far they had come, how blind auditions had opened doors, how new fellowship scholarships had sent underrepresented talents to conservatories, and how tonight's lineup would feature 6 of the musicians selected in those historic tryouts. As she finished, the first violinist, a recent prize winner with gentle hands and a shy smile, stepped forward to introduce the morning's opening piece. The music began with a delicate duet for violin and cello, the strings weaving through each other like intertwined voices that spoke of unity. Behind Amara, the freshly painted mosaic on the plaza wall, a tribute to her initial street concert, shimmered with golden notes and vibrant color. The crowd hushed, and even passing joggers paused to listen as the ensemble's sound rose and fell in waves. A woman in a hijab closed her eyes to savor the resonance. A young boy tapped a drumstick against his thigh, entranced by the pulse. Between sets, Amara mingled with the fellowship musicians, handing a coffee to the percussionist who had just nailed a fiery solo, congratulating the flutist who had overcome her nerves to play with crystalline clarity, and listening as each shared how the symphony's new policies had changed their lives. They spoke of the workshops she led at community centers, where she taught technique and shared stories of resilience, and of the mentorship circles she founded to prepare audition recordings for venues across the region. As the sun climbed higher, the program shifted to a medley of jazz standards, arranged by the symphony's youth ensemble under her guidance. Trumpets, trombones, and rhythm section wove improvisations that invited spontaneous applause, and even a few impromptu dancers who spun and tapped among the audience. Spectators fed off the music's joy, offering cheers so loud that Amara jokingly raised her hand to calm them, only to see more smiles and laughter as the next movement began. In the bronze-toned afternoon light, a representative from 2 neighboring orchestras approached Amara with a proposal to host similar community concerts in their own cities, under the banner of the Open Stage Compact. She listened as they outlined plans to transform municipal plazas and town squares into stages of inclusion, and she felt the same thrill she'd known on that first morning, realizing that a single ripple of change had become a wave sweeping across the region. As the final notes of Beethoven's Ninth Chorus splashed into the river breeze, Amara guided the full ensemble to center stage. The combined sound of strings, winds, percussion, and voices rose in a triumphant affirmation of the journey they had shared, from rejection to reform, from silent exclusion to vibrant celebration. Hands clasped, they bowed together, and the audience rose to their feet, applause echoing through the plaza and into the city beyond. In that moment, Amara knew the symphony's legacy had been rewritten, no longer confined to gilded halls, but alive wherever people gathered to listen, to dream, and to insist that every voice be heard. Years later, Amara returned to Crescent Hall not as a lone challenger, but as its first ever artist in residence, her name engraved alongside the great virtuosic legends in the lobby's marble honor roll. The hall's grand foyer bustled with families ushering children to summer music camps she had founded, and the air hummed with rehearsals for the annual Plaza to Podium concert, a festival she had launched to bring chamber music back to the open air. One spring evening, she stepped onto the main stage for a special gala, celebrating 10 years of the policy reforms she had ignited. Behind her, a massive projection displayed side-by-side images. The empty plaza, where she once played alone, and the vibrant community concerts that now drew thousands. On stage with her stood alumni of the blind audition program, cellists, oboists, percussionists, now principal chairs in the orchestra, their faces shining under the chandelier's glow. Together they launched into a lush performance of Dvořák's Serenade, the strings weaving a rich tapestry of sound that filled every corner of the hall. As the final chord resonated and the audience rose in a standing ovation, Amara stepped forward to speak. Her voice carried the weight of every audition she had ever fought, every crowd she had moved with her street music, every young musician whose dreams she had made possible. She reminded the gathering that inclusion was not a one-time victory, but a living mandate, one that required ongoing vigilance, creativity, and courage. After the applause faded, she mingled in the lobby, greeting patrons who thanked her for transforming the symphony's culture and for mentoring the next generation of artists. Outside, the marble steps were lit with lanterns as impromptu groups gathered to continue the music under the night sky. Spontaneous quartets, jazz combos, even a children's choir rehearsing under a canopy of stars. As she left Crescent Hall that night, violin case in hand, Amara paused on the threshold. She touched the worn mosaic tiles of the plaza entry, still intact after a decade of performances, and she whispered a silent thank you to the young woman who had dared to turn rejection into revolution. And in the hush that followed, as the city lights glimmered on the river beyond, she knew that her own story had become part of a larger symphony, one in which every voice, once silenced by narrow minds, would forever find its place in the chorus of justice and harmony.